Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Selling Greenville, your favorite real estate podcast here in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm your host, as always, Stan McCune, realtor right here in the Greenville area of South Carolina. And you can find all of my contact information in the show notes if you need to reach out to me for any of your real estate needs. Just a reminder, as always, if you benefit from the show in any way, just enjoy it. Even if you don't enjoy it, please smash the like button. Subscribe to the show. Make sure you don't miss future episodes. Maybe even do something fancy like downloading episodes or maybe even leaving a rating or a review. Like all of those things would really benefit the show. We've kind of stagnated a bit. We've been stagnant on some of these ratings and reviews. I know that some of y'all out there are regular listeners to the show that haven't done that. Listen, it only takes a second. So please, if you can, please go ahead and smash that 5-star rating button. Leave a short little review telling the potential listeners or watchers of the show how much you enjoy it. But regardless of whether or not you do that, I appreciate you guys being here, and I appreciate you guys listening, watching, etc. I'm constantly getting messages about the show from various listeners that I've never even met before, never even heard of, and that always excites me. I never pass up an opportunity to communicate with someone that has listened to the show and wants to talk about it, even if you never become a real estate client. I just enjoy those conversations. So thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for listening and all that good stuff. But without further ado, we have a lot to cover today, right? Because we have a situation in politics on all three levels: national, state, local. We have situations brewing right now that just need to be discussed, and I know that a lot of people have told me that they like to hear me talk about politics on the show because I tend to focus more on local politics, not so much the national level, sometimes the state level, but in general, I do tend to focus on the local level. And there's not a whole lot of news that you can get out there on local politics. Obviously, there is news produced by the local media. It tends to leave a little bit to be desired for me because they don't talk about tone a lot of times, right? So they will report. One thing about our local media that I appreciate is that they report in a very flat, very unbiased way what's happening. But sometimes you kind of need to have a little bit of bias when you're talking about this, right? And I'm not saying bias towards one party or another. I'm saying bias towards communicating tone, communicating what has actually happened. If there's anger, if there's frustration, if there's people acting out of control. I don't feel like our local media has in the Greenville area has been particularly has held certain politicians particularly accountable when they've been a little bit out of control. And that's just my opinion, right? I understand why they don't do that. They have to be careful as well. But on this podcast, I'm somewhat careful in terms of how I handle these things. But also the rules that perhaps apply to conventional legacy media don't apply to me, so I can kind of say whatever I want within reason. Okay. So without much further ado, whatever the phrase is, let's just kind of jump right in. The past couple of weeks, as you probably already know, at least from the standpoint of national politics, but just in general, the past couple of weeks have been wild for politics, again, on all three levels: national, state, and Greenville County level. Now, again, this isn't a political show, but I do have some behind the scenes involvement in our local political scene. And just to be clear, it is non-partisan political involvement. I consider myself an independent. All of my political involvement up to this point has been fully independent. I've not affiliated with, this Republican group or this Democrat group or anything like that. I remain independent because personally, I feel pretty much politically homeless. And even though in the state of South Carolina, you have to declare a party, you can still vote in either party's election. So that's something that some people don't like. But I think in the absence of having an option for someone being a third party voter, I think that's which we currently don't have in South Carolina. I think that probably is the best way to handle this. So long story short, I can speak from an educated perspective on what's happening in the Greenville political scene. I'm not the end-all be-all, obviously, with regard to this, but I have insider information to a certain extent. I have communication with people behind the scenes, and I'll just kind of leave it at that. Now, I will mention anything I say on here about politics is my opinion and my opinion alone. It's not reflective of the opinions of any groups that I may be associated with, any political groups, any real estate groups, my brokerage, the Realtor Legislative Committee, anything like that. Nothing that I say on this show is reflective of the opinions of any of those groups. Okay, so I just want to be clear on that, because some people will get it mixed. Don't get it confused. These are just my opinions. I'm not talking about the opinions of anyone else. So all that to be said, much of this episode, I think, will end up being about Greenville and South Carolina politics and what's happening there after last week or the week before now, the runoffs that just happened recently, and the primaries that occurred a few weeks before that. Time travels in a weird way these days, so I'm like trying to think. I think the runoff was last week. It's all just kind of mush. The past few weeks have been crazy for me. But yeah, we're completely through primaries now in the state of South Carolina. And as I've said on the show before, in local politics, sometimes primaries determine who actually wins. And that's the case in many elections right now in Greenville County. We already know who the winner is, even though the general election hasn't happened yet, because there is no general election challenger. 1 second, I need to plug in my computer. Got unplugged while I was setting up for this, apparently. But yeah, we already know the winners for several state and county elections because there's no general election challenger. So these primary elections were very, very important. And some of them came down to just a few votes. Like, this is why it's super duper important that you vote in these smaller primaries, smaller local elections, because your vote really has weight. Your vote in the national and in the presidential election has basically no worth, right? Trump is going to be voted overwhelmingly in the state of South Carolina. I mean, we might see 65 or 70% of votes go towards Trump. No political campaign that you or your friends can drum up can keep Trump from being from winning the state of South Carolina. It's just not going to happen. Okay, let's just be honest. It is, South Carolina is a Trumpy state, like it or not. And probably a lot of my listeners like that, but I know a handful don't. And it is what it is. There's no reason to complain about that. There's no reason to be upset. Just recognize what's obvious and move on. That being said, I do want to speak briefly about the presidential election for a moment, because it does have a bit of relevance here, right? This is a Greenville real estate podcast, Selling Greenville. This is, again, not a political podcast, and it's not a national podcast, but sometimes things happen on the national level that has a trickle-down effect to the Greenville level. So with that in mind, by now, I'm sure that you're aware that we had a weird end of June presidential debate. I mean, this is the earliest debate of my lifetime, an very unusually early debate that the Democratic Party wanted to have. And I think we now know why they wanted to have it early, because the big takeaway was that President Biden did very poorly, and why that impacts when they wanted to have it. I think that they had a suspicion that this was going to happen, and I'm not the only one that thought this. Actually, this was rumored for weeks leading up to the debate, that the Democratic Party wanted to have it early for two reasons. A, in order to, if Biden did well, then they would get a bump going into, the late summer months. And if he did poorly, that would give them time to try to adjust on the fly and maybe perhaps replace him. Now, I'm an independent voter, and I will be completely honest with you guys, okay? I've never voted for Biden or Trump. I personally just have too many irreconcilable differences with both of them. And again, South Carolina is not a swing state. So my vote in the presidential general election is functionally meaningless. Now, I will vote in primaries when there is a presidential primary. I will simply vote against one of those two. And that's exactly what I did this past year. And unfortunately, my candidate did not win. in the primary, and it is what it is. So long story short, I don't have a dog in this fight between Trump and Biden. So why bring it up? Well, there's some really important things that could impact real estate in these presidential elections and these presidential races. First off, I'm sure you know by now, there are rumors galore that Biden may have to withdraw from the race or maybe stiff-armed into withdrawing from the race, or or there might be other things that could happen. Now, I'm recording this on July 2nd, 2024. I was going to record this the past weekend, but I waited as long as I could in the event that some important announcement about Biden came out, right? There were all these stories about how the Biden family was going to Camp David this past weekend. They were going to discuss the president's decision, what he wanted to do, whether he wanted to stay in or potentially pivot. Here we are, July 2nd, and all the headlines that have come out since the weekend are that the Biden family unanimously support President Biden staying in the race. And I think that kind of makes sense from a political strategy for him, right? Obviously, he's a very prideful man. He's been in politics his entire life, career politician. But if he's not capable of running again, you would think he would just have to resign, right? And the president clearly doesn't want to resign. We haven't had that happen in a long time. And so I think this is kind of a saving face thing, like it or not, whether you think it's the right thing for him to do. If he says that he can't run in the race because of his age, how could he possibly finish his term because of his age? So I think that this outcome was predictable. That being said, I still had to wait to make sure that was going to happen, because all bets are off right now. There's a lot of angst right now in the Democrat world and in the world in general about what's going on with Biden, as there should be. He did not look good in that debate. If you didn't watch it, you need to watch it. Watch at least the first 10 to 11 minutes, and you will see why people are freaking out the way they are. It was not a good performance by him. And I said on Facebook, which is, the platform that I do most of my political takes, you can't really win a debate anymore. Like, there's not a whole lot of evidence that that debate wins really boost the presidential campaign, but you can lose a debate. And there's multiple instances of that, and that can really damage a campaign. And I think that's exactly what has happened in the case with Biden. He clearly lost the debate. It's the first time that Trump has had a debate against a presidential challenger that the polls have said that he won, which again, I didn't think it was a particularly good debate by Trump either. I just think that Biden looked horrible the entire time. And so by default, Trump won, but I think it's more accurate to say that Biden lost. So long story short, for the time being, I'm very skeptical that Biden will withdraw from the race. There's no evidence that he's going to do that. But that being said, it's still a possibility. Okay, we cannot completely rule it out. And we cannot completely rule out the possibility of faithless electors and the Democratic National Convention abandoning Biden. Is that likely to happen? Again, not likely to happen, but I think it's very possible. What do I think is the possibility that Biden is not on the November ballot? I'm putting it probably at about 30% is probably what I would think. That might be a little high, but that's just kind of my gut feeling. It's not based off of polls or any statistics. That's just what I think. I think 70% chance Biden is on the ballot, 30% chance he's not, either because he finally decides to withdraw, or potentially faithless electors go rogue and we have an open convention kind of situation, and they end up choosing someone else. That would be insane for them to do that. I don't think that's likely, but it's always possible. We don't know what's happening behind closed doors. So we need to tease out for a second here. If that 30% scenario, that number that I'm coming up with, happens, who would actually replace Biden? Now, I keep hearing Michelle Obama's name, and I don't buy it. She has shown zero political interest since her husband was in office up to this point. And that's just not my opinion. It's well known that she hates how partisan the national political scene is, and she has even irritated Democrats by not publicly supporting the Biden campaign, allegedly, and this is hilarious, because she is angry at how the Bidens have treated a friend of hers who was once married to Hunter Biden. So she's decided to, essentially just abandon the Biden campaign and be as quiet as possible. She only shows up when she absolutely has to, when she has no choice, because she's protective of her friend. You know what? I appreciate that. She doesn't care. Polls overwhelmingly indicate that she would destroy Trump or probably anyone that the Republicans put out there, even if it wasn't Trump. I think almost certainly she would be the next president of the U.S. if she won. And she has that power in her hands. She's just like, no, I'm just going to defend my friend instead. I think that that's more important. And I'm sure, this is, I'm kind of, downplaying the situation. Obviously, she saw firsthand what it's like being president, and obviously, she made a decision. I don't want that, so I'm not buying that Michelle Obama is interested in this at all. I think we would have already known that, and I think that she would already be angling for it. She is not angling for it. Quite the opposite. She's doing things that are angering people behind closed doors in the Democratic Party. So what are some of the other names that we're hearing? Well, obviously California Governor Gavin Newsom, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Vice President Kamala Harris, and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Those are basically the four key people outside of Michelle Obama that we keep hearing that could be a Biden replacement. Here's all I'm going to say about this. I don't think it's going to be Buttigieg. And even if it was, I don't think he would beat Trump. Yes, he's very well spoken. He does very well in debates from the standpoint of just sheer debate acumen. But he doesn't have that kind of personality that commands a room, in my opinion. And unfortunately, like it or not, in these debate kind of settings, that's really the only thing that matters. These debates, people don't listen to debates to try to, figure out who would be the debate captain in high school, or to, think about who's telling the most truth. A lot has been made about how many lies that Trump said during the debate, somewhere between 30 and 50 lies. Yeah, he was lying the whole time. Like, anyone listening or watching could pick up on that pretty easily. Like, even if you're a Trump supporter, I think you'd have a hard time denying that. But it doesn't matter that people don't watch the debates in order to discern truth from error. They watch the debate to look at demeanors and to get a sense of who can control a room, who has, the ability to banter back and forth. It's all the intangible things that people are looking for in those debate settings, and just in general when people are running for president. And I don't think Buttigieg has that. So, on the contrary, we have three others: Newsom, Whitmer, and Harris. And I think any three of those could be possible in this fairly unlikely scenario that Biden withdraws or is kind of ousted from the race. And my thoughts on those three candidates are this: both the governors, Newsom and Whitmer, made decisions during COVID that really hurt the housing market and caused extreme housing and rental inflation, followed by extreme housing and rental deflation in many cases. Newsom, in particular, governs a state where the housing market is dramatically different than any other part of the U.S. I mean, what's happening in California is not comparable to what's happening anywhere else in the U.S. from a housing standpoint. This also happens to be the state that Kamala Harris is from as well. She's from California, and it's probably safe to assume her perspective on real estate, housing, etc., would be similar to Newsom's, although, we can't say for sure because Kamala Harris has kind of been cloaked in obscurity since becoming vice president. Now, my belief is that real estate is extremely local, and it's best left primarily to states and local governments to decide what happens in local real estate markets, how much influence they are going to have. And that's more or less the approach that Trump and Biden have taken up to this point. Now, they've hinted that they are going to take a more heavy-handed approach on real estate. If Biden was, if either one of them were reelected at this point, we'll have to see. They don't have that track record yet. But I've talked about in the past, after Biden's State of the Union, I criticized him for suggesting that he was about to dump a bunch of stimulus into the real estate market. That would be really, really bad. And I'm concerned that the most likely Biden replacements would try as well to have a heavy hand on housing. And here's the thing: this could actually help me as a realtor. For instance, if they did dump a bunch of stimulus into real estate, kind of like what Obama did and like what Biden has hinted that he may do, or that Trump has even made some similar suggestions, not exactly the same, but some similar suggestions of trying to stimulate housing. That would be great for me as a realtor, but it would be bad for real estate and for the economy as a whole, and I am against it. In general, we want real estate to be consistent. We don't like these major fluctuations. It's really bad for the market when all of a sudden you get a bunch of stimulus that gets dumped in, and now we have the supply and demand dynamics go absolutely haywire. And then when that stimulus goes away, then the pendulum goes to the other end of the spectrum, and we see the housing market respond in the opposite way. This is exactly what happened when Obama initiated his stimulus program during the global financial crisis. It temporarily stimulated the housing market, but very quickly that money dried up, and the housing market actually crashed even worse immediately following that. It crashed even worse than it had in 2008 by many metrics. So I'm against that. I wish these people running for president or considering running for president would leave real estate alone. Leave it alone. We don't need your help. States and municipalities have it handled. Just do your job as commander in chief, focusing on our position in terms of safety in the world and all of that, and leave real estate to governors and local politicians. Okay. But I don't know if they're going to do that. So we need to watch this Biden situation closely, because again, it could have major downstream impacts on the housing market. However, there are some additional downstream impacts as well we need to discuss. Even with the debate debacle, the race between Trump and Biden is still a toss-up with plenty of time for Biden to make ground. Like, we're beginning of July. Election is not until November. A lot of people don't start tuning into these elections until September, October. Like, let's be real about this. There's a lot of data out there that indicates that. And so there's still plenty of time left for Biden to make ground, which I suspect he will, right? We're going to start to see this. He's probably going to hit rock bottom here in a week or two. And then things will start to recover as people start to forget about the debate a little bit. And the narrative starts to shift to where, like, well, Biden's still better than Trump, which a lot of people will say. We're already starting to see people saying, even if Biden's a vegetable, even if a vegetable were running against Trump, I would vote for the vegetable, which is kind of an insane take, in my opinion. But I'm seeing a lot of people saying those sorts of things. So whatever. But the thing that very few people are talking about in all of this that I think is a really, really pertinent discussion is the delicate dance that the Federal Reserve has to do in an election year. A little bit of background here. We've talked about this before, but the Federal Reserve is nonpartisan, and that's something they're very proud of. And believe it or not, their actions are consistent with them being nonpartisan. Okay, as it is the current Fed chair, and that's what we call the Federal Reserve for short, the Fed, Jay Powell. He was appointed by Trump, but retained by Biden. So, in theory, he should not have any sort of political leanings. He has, worked with both presidents up to this point. Now, Trump has criticized him quite a bit after he appointed him, but that's the extent of what Trump did to Chair Powell. Now, Powell and the Fed as a whole, they're watching inflation and employment data really, really closely. And a lot of other developed countries have already lowered their rates in response to softening inflation and employment data. But in the US, the Fed has opted to keep their benchmark rates elevated, which has the downstream impact of mortgage rates also remaining elevated. When the Fed rate goes up, mortgage rates go up, generally speaking. When the Fed rate goes down, mortgage rates go down, generally speaking. And the Fed has indicated that they are probably lowering rates potentially once this year. Now, markets think it will be twice, but markets have been off on this topic for multiple years now. And most think that the logical thing for the Fed to do is to lower rates in September. But there's a problem. Lowering rates could impact the November elections in unintended ways. And even if unintended, whoever is more negatively impacted, Trump or Biden, and it's really hard to know who would be impacted more negatively or positively if rates were lowered. We just really don't know. But whoever is impacted more negatively is likely to make a big stink about it. And particularly if Trump is impacted negatively, he's likely to really start to call out on the Fed for being partisan. And Trump has already said that before, by the way, that particularly Jay Powell, the Fed chair, does things with political motivation. And we've talked about this before, but Trump has also threatened, this has been more recently that he's done this, to make advances to try to bring the Fed under his control. Okay, we talked about this on the show that I believe that this is likely to happen at some point, whether Trump or Biden or someone else. But the Fed is the last ultra-powerful government organization to not be partisan. It is only a matter of time before that changes. It changed with the Supreme Court. It's going to change with the Fed at some point. It's just a matter of time. So all that to say, rumors are that the Fed's preference is to hold the line on rates until November, which would be after the elections. Actually, the day after the elections is the most likely scenario in which we see the Fed lower the rates. So perhaps we will see some year-end relief to mortgage rates, but there's a very real possibility that waiting this long for the Fed, if the Fed chooses to wait this long to cut rates, that actually could hurt the economy. And many economists think that if rates aren't lowered sooner than November, unemployment will increase to the point that the possibility of a soft landing goes away and the economy will go straight into recession. Now, as I'm recording this, we just have jobs opening data that was just released, and the data was indicative that job openings are basically they're going up. Okay, it is the initial reading of the data. Now this data gets revised, but essentially when job openings go up, that tends to be reflective of a stronger economy, right? More employers are looking to fill jobs. That's a very simplistic way of thinking about it, but is a general heuristic that people use, and including the Fed. And immediately the Fed put out, well, actually, even before that data was released, the Fed was putting out a bunch of statements, particularly Jay Powell, basically telling people, hey, we know that there is, in his words, a two-way risk. What's he saying? A risk of waiting on rate cuts versus a wait on immediately making the rate cuts. What they don't want to do is make cuts and then see inflation take off again. But they also don't want to wait too long. And then what tends to happen historically is this unemployment starts to snowball and it starts to reach a point where it takes, even if the Fed does something, the Fed just tinkering with rates, that's a very blunt force tool, and it doesn't have immediate impacts. That's why they've been waiting so long to see the impact of the rate increases that they've done the past 2 years, right? They've been waiting to see because it's a lagging measure. It takes time for these rate increases or decreases to impact things. So that is something that they are, again, weighing very closely and trying to figure out, trying to get the timing just right. Odds are they won't get the timing just right, but muddled in all of this are these presidential elections. So now we have to wait and see how all this shakes out. To me, I think it's pretty clear that rates are going to remain where they are until at least September. And if I had to bet, I would bet it's going to be after the elections before we see any sort of a rate decrease, because the national political climate just demands that, in my opinion. And so we're unlikely to see major mortgage rate decrease. I mean, even if they wait until November to decrease rates, if they only decrease rates by 25 basis points, that's really not going to have a whole lot of impact anyway on mortgage rates, in my opinion. So it is what it is. This is the political climate we find ourselves in, and housing is wedged in between all of this that's happening. And of course, that's something that we will just have to keep track of because we have no control over any of this. This is all outside of our control. And so we just have to track it and see what happens. Okay, that's all for the national stuff. Let's pivot to county and state elections, which I'm much more passionate about. And I want to talk big picture for a moment. But before we do that, we need to talk about Piper Insurance Group. This is Selling Greenville's first official sponsor. And let me tell you, Piper Insurance Group, Stephen Piper, who who runs the show over there. They've been great for me and for my clients, and I cannot recommend them more highly to you guys. They handle home, auto, and umbrella insurance. They're an independent insurance agency, meaning that they can quote with different carriers, different insurance companies that have different products, which, by the way, really important right now because insurers are starting to pull out of states that have a coastline. And so we have fewer options for homeowners insurance now than we did a few years ago as a result of this. So it's really important that you price things out with an independent agency to get the best possible quote. They can handle investment properties. That's a question I get sometimes is what insurance company can handle my investment properties, my vacant homes, my flips, my rentals, my new construction, et cetera, my commercial properties. They can handle all of that. And they're not just licensed in South Carolina. They're also licensed in North Carolina and Georgia. So if you dabble in either of those states, they can help you as well. That's Piper Insurance Group. Their contact information is in the show notes. And I recommend that you call them whenever you have your first availability to get a free quote today. All right, back to state and local politics. To get to the chase, I want to say that there is no longer an incumbency advantage in South Carolina. We've seen this brewing for a while, but I think now we can definitively say there is no incumbency advantage in our state. And you might even say that nationally as well in a lot of ways. Now, usually, historically, if you're an incumbent, name recognition alone would give you an advantage over the field, particularly in local elections where people hardly know what the people running are, what their platforms are, what they're doing, because they just don't have exposure to these people. But that incumbency advantage is going away. Okay, voters are angry, and the anger is varied and widespread. And many voters are not angry about the same things, right? They're just angry. And when you have a consortium of angry voters, that anger is directed rightly or wrongly at incumbents, the people currently in office who are running for re-election. So long story short, many incumbents were voted out in our state primaries that happened a few weeks ago and the runoffs that happened this past week. So what's going on here? Well, I've discussed in the past that people getting voted out due to anti-development sentiment of the NIMBY crowd is a big phenomenon here. We've had a lot of people that have been voted out strictly because they got lumped in with being pro-development, whatever that means. And the NIMBY, not my backyard crowd that does not want development near their home and that wants to impose their beliefs on everyone else, as everyone does these days, they have been systematically finding ways to get these people out of office. And out of county council and out of city council. And this was a factor this year as well as it has been for the past several years, but a lot more played in. I did not feel like the development emphasis was as big, the anti-development emphasis. I did not see it as big as what I've seen in previous elections. Now, I've already mentioned that South Carolina is a very Republican state, one of Trump's strongest states, if not his strongest state, arguably. And the discord around primaries ultimately became around who the real conservatives are that are running, which to me is kind of silly, right? These are primaries. And yet we still had people saying that certain people running for county council were quote unquote rhinos, Republicans in name only. And I don't know. To me, it's kind of ridiculous. I personally don't think that we should even have partisan county council elections. Like, why is that even necessary? Why does it matter whether you're Republican or Democrat? Like, that name means something very different on the national level than it does on the county level. So I would prefer, in order to avoid muddying the waters, that we didn't even have partisan county elections. But it is what it is. This is the world that we live in. And as a result of that, a few themes emerged in these Republican primaries that happened on the state and local level. One was using Trump support as a litmus test. I saw this over and over again. People wanted to know what the people running for county council, what their views on Trump were. And if anyone had ever expressed that they were dissatisfied with Trump, that got blasted everywhere on mailers, on social media, anywhere that you can imagine that is a part of the local political narrative. Anyone that was anti-Trump or even indifferent towards Trump they got completely hammered for that. Another one was anti-tax settlement, right? County council recently raised property taxes, and uh, I was against that. That was something that, I told people that they needed to be aware of it. Guess what? Nobody showed up to county council to protest. I shouldn't say nobody. Very few people showed up to protest it. County council passed it, and now people are angry about it. And so anti-tax sentiment, that was a big one. A lot of debate over who is truly a fiscal conservative versus who isn't. Another one, number 3, social conservative. Yeah, I had a bad moment there. Social conservatism really bled into these local races, and I've talked about this before. I don't like this. I don't like social conservatism to have a major impact on county races. I'm not going to say that it's completely unimportant, but county council and coroner and whatnot, what they believe on the Second Amendment, what they believe on abortion, things like that. Okay, that tells you a little bit about their thought process, but they don't have impact policy-wise into those things. Those are things that happen on the state and national level. And so I feel like it is a convenient distraction from asking these people about topics that they actually can impact, like infrastructure, like taxes, things of that nature. And so I'm not a huge fan of that, but that definitely played heavily into these races. And as well, a lot of irrational scares about special interest groups supporting one candidate or another, with many who affiliate with the quote-unquote Freedom Caucus or who simply identify as ultra-conservative, taking, ironically, in my opinion, a Bernie Sanders-esque approach of telling voters that if their candidates got money from any group that wasn't Greenville-based, they were being influenced by special interest groups, okay? Very fascinating development. I've never heard this used quite to this extent on the local and state level, but it was used very, very heavily, and that was interesting. A lot of people stoking concerns about candidate X or candidate Y. They received money from this group outside of Greenville. They're taking dark money. They're doing backdoor deals. All this kind of stuff. And I've been involved in the background of the political scene in Greenville for quite some time. I've never seen that reach the point that it reached, but it was a very effective strategy for some people that ran for office. And let's talk about that point first, okay? Because I do want to discuss this and to diffuse some misinformation that's out there, or to disarm some misinformation that's out there. I know a bit how money flows from these special interest groups, from political action committees and the like. Here's how it typically works. Usually there is a Greenville-based committee that makes a recommendation to a South Carolina-based PAC. It might be even outside of South Carolina. It could be a DC-based PAC, but it's typically coming from a Greenville group, right? Otherwise, how would a state-level PAC, or how would a PAC outside of the state know who they're going to support for a local election where there's very little information about the candidate? The recommendation has to come from the local level almost always. The only exception that I am aware of is if one of the candidates really did something that irritated, one of these special interest groups. And that typically only comes from an incumbent, right? And in a lot of cases, the back and forth I was seeing with people over these special interest groups and over the money wasn't about incumbents. It was about people that were running for the first time. So the money that comes from outside of Greenville, because that's where the money is located, right? These PACs, these special interest groups, are not Greenville based. It's coming from outside of Greenville, but in reality, the money is actually coming from Greenville because it's a Greenville committee or subcommittee that made the recommendation to spend it in a Greenville race to a state or national group. So we just need to be honest about that to start, right? When people talk about money coming in from outside of Greenville, you have to really get down to, did it really come from outside of Greenville, or was it a Greenville group that's affiliated with a bigger group that ultimately made that recommendation? So we'll start with that. I'm not going to get into specifics on which campaign I felt like was benefiting from actual Greenville money versus not, versus actually getting dark money from DC or from Columbia or whatever the case may be. That's not my point. I just want to make sure that you guys understand that oftentimes when people talk about this dark money and use all these terminologies, they actually don't know what they're talking about, and oftentimes it is misleading. Okay. Now, that part I find interesting, but it's not the most important thing to me. The part that I think is significant is the anti-tax sentiment and the focus on social conservatism. And I also want to mention this. I actually didn't intend to mention this, but one thing that was interesting, I'm not going to really talk about the Trump support as a litmus test point that I made earlier. We kind of see what's happening there. National politics is bleeding into all levels of politics. It is what it is. But there's one really interesting race, and that was between William Timmons, an incumbent, versus Alan Morgan, Adam Morgan. Sorry, we have two Morgans, and they're both brothers that run in our area, and I frequently get them confused. I believe it was Adam Morgan going up against William Timmons, and so we had an interesting situation. Timmons is a Trump guy and an incumbent, and Morgan was running on social conservatism and low tax and all of that. Morgan ultimately lost. He was one of the few people that was associated with that Freedom Caucus group that actually lost. And you know what? I think it was 100% because Timmons got the Trump support. So that was an interesting thing that happened. We saw that Trump support trumps some of these other things that people are concerned about. Now, Morgan didn't lose in Greenville. His district included Greenville and Spartanburg. He lost Spartanburg really badly, and he won Greenville by a hair. And so Spartanburg was actually the deciding factor. Spartanburg, people don't realize, more conservative slash Trump leaning. For those that don't prefer the term conservative, more in that camp than Greenville County at this stage in the game. Okay, all right. Kind of got off track there, but I just found that to be an interesting dynamic. Okay, let's go back to the anti-tax sentiment and emphasis on social conservatism really influencing these races. I personally consider myself to be pretty conservative, at the very least fiscally. I think I'm pretty conservative socially, although people would probably claim that I lean more left socially than most in South Carolina, but that's only because South Carolina is so socially conservative. It's really hard to be right of that, right? It's almost impossible to be more conservative than the average South Carolina resident. So if someone says that I'm more liberal socially than the average South Carolinian, I say, okay. I think 95% of the U.S. population would be that way. But I digress. All right. I feel like people have taken these social litmus tests way too far, in my opinion. People, I understand, are upset that property taxes were raised by the county. I've already mentioned that. I was a part of a committee that attempted to prevent the county from raising property taxes. The county didn't listen. People didn't listen. They didn't go out to protest. And so it happened. And I get that people were upset about it. I was upset about it as well. I don't want to see my property taxes going up. But unless a candidate essentially promised no tax increases, they were not voted in. That was the way this went. If there were any suspicions that a candidate was running and would potentially increase taxes on any level, they lost their primary. And there was no potential for a nuanced discussion. And people want Greenville County Council to fix the roads and improve our infrastructure, and they want our state to do all these things. Well, in the county, on the county level, we need over $2 billion to fix our roads. And the money isn't there. I've talked about this before. I'm not going to rehash it all. But I just want to ask people, if you're running on an anti-tax, or if you're voting for people simply because they're anti-tax, what do you really want? Do you want infrastructure to deteriorate and not be able to be repaired? Or do you want tax increases? Because you can't have both. You can't have lower taxes and improved infrastructure. We are past that point. Okay. There are a lot of economic theories out there that claim that you could have your cake and eat it. And we know now that's not possible, right? people are still, I mean, you go on Nextdoor every day, people complain about the roads. Nextdoor is a social media platform for neighbors, basically. It's a nasty platform. I don't recommend it. People are complaining about the roads all the time. The same people complaining about taxes complain about the roads. Where's the money going to come from, right? And they say, well, we need to get money from the state and from the federal government. Guys, we've gotten money. We've gotten grants and whatnot, and it's not enough to fix the problem. You can't have it both ways. So I'm fine. Again, I'm not a big tax person myself. I generally am anti-tax myself. I would love if we could abolish the income tax in South Carolina. Unfortunately, ironically, one of the people that ran on a zero income tax platform did not win. And there was a variety of reasons for that. But again, you have to don't be disingenuous, okay? You have to choose either I'm anti-tax and we're going to have a deteriorating infrastructure and I'm okay with that, or I want infrastructure improvements to be made and we need to raise the money for that in one way or another. And the simplest way from point A to point B is tax increases, because budget tinkering is not going to produce $2 billion plus. It's just not. We don't have that sort of budget. Now, we have a penny sales tax coming on the November ballot to fix a huge portion of the roads in Greenville, take care of essentially half that $2 billion deficit. And I've said before that on this podcast, I've said before that even though I am relatively anti-tax, again, and by relatively, I mean, I'm like way more anti-tax than a lot of people, perhaps not compared to most people in the state of South Carolina, because I see both sides. And I've seen that our tax structure currently isn't enough. But I am an anti-tax guy in general. I have pretty libertarian views that I hold to. And in my opinion, despite that, this penny sales tax is the only fair solution that county council has been able to come up with in decades to truly make a dent in the infrastructure, particularly the road problems that we have here in the state. But now that we've seen how these elections played out, I'm concerned the tax won't pass and we'll be back to square one. We'll be back to everyone just bickering over the roads and nobody doing anything about it. And basically the ability of that tax to pass hinges on Democratic voters turning out, voters who typically are more pro-tax, because I don't anticipate it getting much Republican support. So in November, if Democrats stay home because they're discouraged by the Biden campaign or whatnot, we are not going to see the penny sales tax pass, and we're not going to see roads improved. It's really that simple. Now, what about social issues? Well, I typically don't name names, but this is right out there in the public. You can find it very easily. And so I'm just going to say it. Steve Shaw, who is the councilman in my district, got reelected with a heavy focus on social issues. Why? County council has almost no impact on social issues, right? I've already talked about this. And I saw on his Facebook page, this cracked me up. Some people expressed concern over the county's involvement in schools. And Councilman Shaw said that the schools are outside of what the county council can influence. And yet, he's focused on making Greenville County, it was a big campaign point of his, a Second Amendment sanctuary, which is also something that the county council doesn't influence. I mean, come on. Second Amendment is not a county level, the Constitution is not a county level document. And the state has made South Carolina one of the most Second Amendment friendly states already in the United States. Nobody needed Greenville County to be a Second Amendment sanctuary. I don't even know what that means. It's not something that's important. So I personally have issues with people playing both sides on the social issues thing, saying, well, we're not involved with schools or libraries or things like that, but we are involved with the Second Amendment. Come on, that's disingenuous. I'm not trying to pick on Shaw specifically. I saw many people who ran talk out of both sides of their mouth on these issues, but you know what? It worked. Shaw won his primary in a runoff, and good for him. He made it. He played a political game and he won. But long story short, I'm not particularly optimistic about the direction that local or state politics are heading in. By my count, now 7 out of 12 Greenville County Council people will be brand new or will have been on the council for 4 years or fewer after the November elections. And rumors are that those 7 intend to essentially do a hostile takeover of county council, right? They've got a majority. So the 7 intend to gang up on the more experienced 5 members who who remain in order to take power away from them and turn the county, quote unquote, more conservative. Which, listen, Greenville County is already, again, it's very conservative. I don't know how you can make it more conservative, but this is what what they think that they're going to do. And if you're a conservative listening to this, that might sound great on the surface. But what it most likely means is focusing on conservative virtue signaling, right? Talking about the Second Amendment and abortion and things that the county doesn't impact. Virtue signaling and not actually getting anything done on infrastructure issues that need to be improved. Not to mention, likely more measures to stonewall development in the area, right? That's something I've talked about extensively in the past that I haven't talked about much in this podcast. But I mean, how are we going to raise more tax revenue if we're going to stonewall development? Like, that's literally the only way that we can keep increasing tax revenue without actually increasing taxes. Similar things happened as well on the state level in the House and Senate. Major underdogs won many races. It was really shocking. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. It could be a very good thing. I'm actually happy that there's not an incumbency advantage anymore. But some very good legislators lost their seats, not on the basis of their record, but on the basis of voters just being angry or paranoid, in my opinion. And the State House in particular, which was already incredibly divided, got voted in some people that I think will just divide it even more. And I'm not optimistic for the state of our state legislature after these elections. Long story short, the political winds in the state and county are clearly shifting, and this is going to have major downstream effects on real estate. It would appear to me that property taxes are likely to not be increased under the new guard, but we'll see what they think once they realize that we don't have enough money for them to really do anything without some sort of tax increase. Like, eventually they're going to receive enough phone calls from their constituents complaining about roads and infrastructure that they're going to have to tell them something. And what are they going to tell them? I have a hunch at some point these anti-tax people are going to start whispering amongst themselves, where can we increase taxes? Would property taxes be the way to go about it? In their mind, I don't know. For all the talk about affordable housing, not one person who has voted in the county council or the state legislature has, in my opinion, any meaningful solutions for housing affordability. Not on their radar. They don't care. They talk out of both sides of their mouth. They say they're going to improve housing affordability, but all of their proposals for development would do the opposite. And that's just going to make real estate less affordable. So elections have consequences. And while I am bullish on South Carolina and Greenville in the long term, you guys know that. This is a bit of a downer episode, but you guys know I'm bullish on the area in the long term. I am concerned about what these next 4 years are going to look like. And personally, I'm looking at ways into bringing more accountability, particularly to county council, because that's something I don't feel like there's a lot of good information out there on what they're doing. But that's something that we'll have to talk about another day, because I'm not exactly sure how I'm gonna go about that or what exactly I'm gonna do. I'm just kind of bouncing some ideas around in my head. If you guys want to give me your ideas for that, or have ideas for what you think would be helpful, please let me know. And that's a great way to end this episode, because my contact information is in the show notes, and that's how you will let me know what you're thinking. And as well, Piper Insurance Group, their information is in the show notes. Contact them for a free quote today. Please like, rate, review, subscribe, all those good things with this show. Make sure you don't miss future episodes. We will talk again next time.